I am going to record this session so I can post it on my website tomorrow. And as I mentioned before the meditation, today I want to talk about some of the places that the Buddha taught in and meditated in during the basically 45 years after his awakening, before he died in Kushinagar. And I want to start with a town that was called Shrvasti. It's now called Shrvasti, and it was the capital of the ancient kingdom of Kosala, and it's a place where the Buddha stayed and lived quite a lot after his awakening. And Shrvasti is mentioned quite often in the suttas, so you'll often see that name. But let me just share my screen. There we go. Oh, it's gone away. It should. There it is. Can everyone see that? I don't know what happened there. Okay, so Shrvasti. And perhaps the best known site in Shrvasti is Jeta's Grove. And this is the ruins of, or reconstructed ruins of one of the monasteries in Shrvasti. And I was there on quite a warm day. It was quite early in the morning. You can see the shadows are quite long here. And I saw these little beings, 1, 2, 3, taking in the morning sun. These dogs, there are a lot of wild dogs in India, and some of them like to hang out at the Buddhist sites. So this is the place where the Buddha gave a lot of his teachings and discourses, and he stayed here for 19 out of the 45 rains retreats after his awakening. And rains retreats were held every year during the monsoon season, when the monks came together as a sangha. For the rest of the year, they were wandering around from village to village, either individually or in small groups, teaching and begging for alms, food, and also asking for a place to stay. But in the rainy season, the Buddha had them come into monasteries such as this one, partly because it was difficult to travel in the monsoon season, but also because the Buddha didn't want the monks and nuns to trample and kill earthworms and other small creatures that came to the surface of the earth when it was raining. So this is called Jeta's Grove because it was given to the Buddha, this land, by Anathapindika. And Anathapindika was a wealthy merchant in Shrvasti, and he was also possibly the Buddha's main male patron. And the story goes that this was originally a grove of trees, and you can see there's still some left, that this grove originally belonged to Prince Jeta, and he was the king's son, King Pasenadi's son. And Anathapindika offered to buy the grove from the prince so that he could give it to the Buddha. But the prince didn't want to sell it. And Anathapindika said, well, please, won't you sell it to me? And what would your price be? And so on. And eventually the prince jokingly said that he would sell it to Anathapindika if he could cover the entire grove with gold coins. And Anathapindika agreed. And of course, Prince Jeta didn't think that Anathapindika was wealthy enough to have enough gold coins to cover the grove, but he did. And so Anathapindika went away and then came back with wagons full of gold pieces and covered the park with them. And when Prince Jeta saw this, he said, oh, well, I was only joking, and refused to sell the park. So they went to arbitration. They had arbitration back then. And the arbitrators concluded that the prince had set a price, that the price had been met, and so he had to sell the park. And so he did. And today, Jeta's Grove is a historic park, a Buddhist site with the remains of many monasteries and stupas and huts, or kutis as they're called, Kutis, kutis, which are the little small huts that the monks and nuns used to live in and still do. If you go to monasteries today, the monks still often live in kutis. And at Jeta's Grove, there are the remains of the kuti that the Buddha supposedly stayed in when he was there at Jeta's Grove. And this is the restored version of that kuti. It's called the Gandhakuti. So this is where the Buddha supposedly stayed when he was in Jeta's Grove. And you can see another little furry friend down here taking a morning nap. And another one up here. And right here in the middle is a kind of mini stupa, very mini version, that is a place where pilgrims leave offerings to the Buddha. You'll see it's been covered in gold leaf by pilgrims, and their flowers, garlands of flowers here, and people are leaving offerings at the Gandhakuti. Close by to Jeta's Grove, also in the area around Shrvasti, there is a stupa to Anathapindika that he built while he was still alive, and that contained his relics. As you can see, it's kind of in a state of semi disrepair here and falling down, but it's been restored at some point. So that's Anathapindika's stupa. There's also this stupa, Angulimala's stupa, which is also not been restored, which is a shame, because Angulimala has a fascinating story in Buddhism, and it's quite a well-known story, and here it is. So Angulimala grew up as an intelligent young man in Shrvasti, and during his studies, he became his teacher's favorite student. However, Angulimala's fellow students became very jealous of him and decided to try to get rid of him. So they started saying untrue things about him to the teacher. And eventually the teacher started believing what the other students were saying. And he called to Angulimala to come to him. And he told Angulimala that he must leave and he must collect 1,000 little fingers of human beings in order to complete his studies. And of course the teacher thought, well, he'll leave and he'll never do that. because it would mean killing people, and it would be a way of getting rid of Angulimala. But Angulimala was so faithful to his teacher that he complied with the teacher's request and killed supposedly 999 people and cut off one of their little fingers, and then strung them together in a necklace which he wore around his neck. Pretty gruesome necklace. And then one day when he was looking for his 1000th victim, his final victim, Angulimala saw the Buddha and ran after him, intending to kill him and cut off his little finger. And Angulimala shouted out to the Buddha to stop where he was. And the Buddha replied to Angulimala, "It is you that has not stopped." And of course he was referring to the fact that Angulimala was still running after his cravings and desires in order to kill people and get their little fingers and comply with his teacher's pretty crazy wishes. Then Angulimala asked for an explanation of what the Buddha had said, that he hadn't stopped running. And the Buddha explained and said that a good monk, good person, should always control his cravings and desires. And Angulimala, as the story goes, was so impressed by the Buddha's courage at standing up to him that he felt all of a sudden very guilty for killing so many people. And on the spot, he vowed to stop killing people and to ordain as a monk, which he did. Meanwhile, the king, King Pasenadi, had set out to find Angulimala and kill him because he wanted to punish the murderer, this Angulimala who'd killed all these people. But first, King Pasenadi decided to pay a visit to the Buddha at Jeta's Grove, where we were a minute ago. And the king explained, when he got there, the king explained to the Buddha what he was doing, that he'd gone in search of Angulimala to kill him. And the Buddha asked the king what he would do if he were to discover that Angulimala had given up killing people and had become a monk. And the king said that he would salute Angulimala and offer to provide for him as a monk, because he thought it was so unlikely excuse me, that Angulimala would renounce his wicked ways and become a monk. Then, of course, the Buddha reveals that Angulimala is just sitting a few feet away from the king with his head shaved, his hair shaved off, and his beard shaved off, now a Buddhist monk. And of course, King Pasenadi then has to follow through on his commitment to support Angulimala as a monk, which he does. So that's the story of Angulimala, and it's very well known in Buddhism. And it basically speaks to the power of renunciation and forgiveness and the capacity of all of us to transform our ways. So also, while I was in the neighborhood of Shrvasti, I visited Visakha's Stupa, which is here. And as you can see, it's kind of been turned into, I don't know, a barn for animals, something like that, with a thatched roof. And this stupa that's in virtual ruins is very important in Buddhism, even though it's not a tourist site and you can only get to it on some very narrow country roads, which fortunately, just driving a car, I was able, or my drivers were able to reach it. You couldn't get there on a tourist bus or a coach. And Visakha is important. She's a woman because she was one of the Buddha's two main female patrons. She was very loyal to the Buddha. And after she died, a stupa was built, and her remains were buried somewhere in the stupa, and this is all that's left of it now. But also there's this shrine to Visakha, and this is what it looks like today. And in the middle here, this is actually the remains of an Ashokan pillar. Remember we talked about Ashokan pillars? And this is now worshipped as a representation of the Hindu god Shiva, the Shiva Lingam. But originally it was an Ashokan pillar. And while we were there were some kids, about a dozen kids, playing around here and around the stupa that I just showed you. And Jackie, my guide, asked the kids if they knew about the significance of this place, who Visakha was, who King Ashoka was, who built the pillar, who the Buddha was. And they didn't have a clue. They just thought it was, their playground, and they knew that it was worshipped, that it was a Hindu worship site. So Jackie got quite upset and proceeded to give them a lecture in Hindi on the spot about the history of this place, about the Buddha and King Ashoka and Visakha. And some of the moms came over to listen as well. And I don't know if the kids were really interested or not. They certainly looked interested, but of course you never know with teenagers. They were maybe 8 or 9 years old up to about 15 years old. And anyway, at least they listened. Whether they took it in or not, I don't know. So now let's move on to the places around a town called Rajgir. And Rajgir is home to many Buddhist sites, including the Bamboo Grove. And I apologize for the quality of this, the pixelated quality of this slide. And it's also home to Vulture Peak and Nalanda. And I'm going to talk about just the Bamboo Grove and Vulture Peak today, and I'll talk about Nalanda next week. So this is the Bamboo Grove, obviously so named because it has bamboos in it. It's not a huge site, it's pretty small, it's more like a small park. And this site was given to the Buddha by King Bimbisara, who was king of the Magadha nation. And the Buddha spent several rains retreats here, not as many as he spent at Jeta's Grove, but he also taught many of the early discourses here. And today these bamboos are still here, not the original ones of course, and there's also some trees and flowers and a large pond, and I've got a slide of the pond. This one I had to take from the web. So again, I apologize for the quality. And here you can see some of the trees, and there's a statue of the Buddha over here and steps down into the water of the pond in the Bamboo Grove. And it's pretty quiet. It wasn't a real popular tourist site, although it is on the tourist track. So now to move to Vulture Peak. So Vulture Peak is a very well-known Buddhist site. It was one of the Buddha's favorite places to meditate, and also where he gave many of his teachings. And if I can get the cursor back, there we are. So this is the path up to Vulture Peak. And you can see pilgrims wearing white. Actually, this one here, she's selling malas. So she's actually not a pilgrim because she's selling these mala beads. And there are people coming along here. And it's called Vulture Peak. It's a mountain, because it resembles a seated vulture, a vulture sitting down with its wings kind of tucked up and folded underneath it. And Vulture Peak is frequently mentioned in the suttas. And it doesn't look like too much of a climb on this in this photo, but the climb up to Vulture Peak from the valley floor is actually a 2,000-foot gain in elevation, and parts of it are very steep. Originally, on the steep parts, King Bimbisara built steps into the mountain so that he could climb up the steps, make it easy for himself, climb up the steps to go and talk to the Buddha. And there are still steps there today, and on one rather hot, muggy late afternoon, I did the climb up from the valley floor and arrived rather breathless at the top of Vulture Peak. And this is looking down from Vulture Peak, and you can see this here, it's a little bit steeper, and you can see all of the Tibetan prayer flags everywhere strung across the path and down into the valley below. So this is Vulture Peak is really a sacred site, and at the top, just almost kind of round the corner from here, so you'd come up these steps here, you can see these are steps, and then round here is a small cave that looks like this, and this is thought to be the where the Buddha meditated, in this cave. And you can see inside there are some candles here and a little statue of the Buddha. This is really low, you have to crawl in here. This is about, I don't know, no more than 2.5 feet, 3 feet high, less than 3 feet. So you can't walk into it. And here on the rocks, again, you'll see above the cave, you'll see that gold leaf has been pressed into the rocks by pilgrims as offerings to the Buddha. So also at Vulture Peak, there's an open area that isn't that bad, but it has a magnificent view down over the valley, and this is kind of outside the cave what it looks like. There's this walled area here, and inside only monastics were allowed, so the rest of the lay people, including me, were outside the wall. And these monks are praying towards the setting sun. So it's a tradition to go walk up to Vulture Peak and meditate and pray and watch the sun go down, which is what I did, exactly that. And so here is the sun going down from Vulture Peak. This is the view, and you can see the air pollution that I've been talking about. It's pretty yucky, but here you can also see the path. Here's the path coming up right here. And that was to something else, but here's the path coming up, and you can actually see people on there. So, and here's somebody's head. So it was pretty crowded up there at sunset, but I did manage to do a little bit of meditation, and certainly enjoyed seeing the sun set. So then we came down from Vulture Peak, and the next day drove from Rajgir to Vaishali. And Vaishali is another very well-known pilgrimage site for Buddhism. And you may remember that a couple of weeks ago, I talked about Prince Siddhartha as he was known before his enlightenment, and how he left his family in the royal palace in Kapilavastu to seek a way to end suffering. Well, when he left Kapilavastu, when he left the palace and renounced the world, Vaishali was the first place that he came to. And it's the place that he did his initial training with Alara Kalama, who I mentioned a couple of weeks ago. And so now we're in Vaishali, and first I visited the Buddha Relic Stupa. This is what it looks like. And obviously this roof is a fairly recent addition. It's not the original stupa at all. There's nothing left of the walls of the original stupa. But because the stupa was abandoned basically after it was built and only rediscovered in 1958 after the dome had completely caved in, and there wasn't much left, but it was found and this roof was built. And then if you go inside here, you can see there's actually a glass and a railing round here. If you go inside, this is what it looks like inside. This is the stupa itself, the original stupa, and you can see the railing round here and somebody looking in. And this is where, right in here, is where a portion of the Buddha's relics were discovered in 1958 in a casket. Remember, I was talking, I think, with Lupe about the caskets a couple of weeks ago. And so they found a casket, and inside the casket, they found ashes mixed with earth, a piece of conch shell, some beads, a thin gold leaf, and a coin, interestingly. So this is thought to be some of the remains of the Buddha, and the casket is now on display at the Patna Museum. Patna's not very far from Vaishali. So pretty amazing. You weren't allowed to walk down here, you just had to kind of look in here. So also around Vaishali is this, and this here in the foreground is called the Kutagarshala. And the Kutagarshala is, or was, a monastery where the Buddha stayed frequently when he was in Vaishali. And it's about a mile and a half from the Relic Stupa that I just showed you. So the monastery where he stayed was here. But of course, there's also this amazing Ashokan pillar, which is in excellent condition. It's in better condition than almost any other standing Ashokan pillar. And the pillar is said to mark the spot of the Buddha's last teaching. He gave his last teaching in Vaishali, and in that teaching he announced that he would die soon. And so you'll see the lion capital on top, and the lion is actually facing towards Kushinagar, where he eventually did die, and it's a rather sad looking lion. If you look at it through binoculars, you can see that the lion has a sad face. It's not kind of a triumphant face or a victorious face. It's a pretty sad looking lion looking towards the place that the Buddha died when he was 79 or 80 years old. And this big stupa here is called the Ananda Stupa. Ananda, of course, was one of the Buddha's leading disciples, and also his attendant, his primary attendant for about 20 years. And it's said that the Ananda Stupa is the place where the second Buddhist council was held in the 2nd century BCE. And it was organized by King Kalasoka. There were a series of, one would say probably 5 Buddhist councils, held. Originally, there was one right after the Buddha died, and then the second one was held to iron out some, or to try to resolve some doctrinal differences. And there was a fifth Buddhist council held not very long ago, I think in Burma. Anyway, this is said to be the site of the second Buddhist council. But for me in Vaishali, even though this is very impressive and very grand, for me the most important thing in Vaishali was this, and you can see the Ananda Stupa and the Ashokan pillar over here. And I was told this is the site of the first nunnery, the first monastery where nuns lived. And it was here in Vaishali that the Buddha allowed women to ordain as nuns. And it was here that a nunnery was built for them after they had ordained. And you may remember that the story of the nun's ordination from the Therigatha poems that I talked about in January, if you were here, and in particular the story of Pajapati Gautami, who was the first Buddhist nun. She was the first woman ordained by the Buddha. And just to recap her story a little bit, because it's so interesting, Pajapati Gautami was the Buddha's stepmom, foster mom, and his aunt. So she was married. She and her sister Maya, who was the Buddha's mom, were both married to King Suddhodana of the Sakyan clan. And Maya got pregnant first, and then after the Buddha's birth, 10 days after he was born, Maya died, and the Buddha, Prince Siddhartha, was raised by Pajapati Gautami as her own child. And she went on to have two children herself, but she treated the Buddha or Prince Siddhartha equally with her as her own flesh and blood. And so eventually, of course, the Buddha's father, King Suddhodana, and Pajapati's husband, he dies. And Pajapati, who by then is a lay follower of the Buddha, starts offering teachings and becomes very popular, especially among women. And especially among widows who had very, very poor social standing in the Buddha's time. So Pajapati Gautami gets pretty well known and apparently has 500 followers, and they decide that they really want to be ordained as nuns. So they leave Kapilavastu and walk about 150 miles to try to find the Buddha and to ask him to ordain them. And they catch up with the Buddha in Vaishali, and Pajapati asks the Buddha to ordain her and the other women, and the Buddha famously says no 3 times. But Pajapati is really persistent, and Ananda sees her persistence. And so then Ananda goes to the Buddha and asks on Pajapati's behalf. But he still says no, twice. And then the last time, Ananda tries a different tack. And he reminds the Buddha of all of the love and kindness that Pajapati has showered on him as a child, and bringing him up as her own child. And Ananda goes on to suggest that it would be really good if women like Pajapati could become nuns. And this argument finally convinces the Buddha, and he agrees to ordain Pajapati along with her 500 followers. Of course, being a male-dominated society, he imposes some extra rules on the nuns that the monks are not required to follow, and Pajapati reluctantly agrees to them. And then after their ordination, the nunnery is built, and this is where the nuns supposedly lived. So I spent a long time here because the cause of full ordination of Buddhist nuns, as some of you know, is very near and dear to my heart. And I also found myself wondering if some of the Therigatha poems that we read, these poems of the first Buddhist nuns, were actually written here. And I suspect they were. And that, reading those poems today and looking at them, they're very, very lovely poems. And I'm hoping to do another one, go through another one, read another one with you in a few weeks' time. So that's Vaishali. And then after the Buddha left Vaishali for the last time, and let me say, he ordained the nuns on an earlier visit to Vaishali, not his last visit. I should have said that. But when he leaves Vaishali for the last time, he travels to a small town called Kesariya, walks there, and it's about 35 miles from Vaishali to Kesariya. And by then, gossip being gossip, people knew that the Buddha had said that he would die soon. And so they began to follow him in larger and larger numbers. And in particular, a local tribe called the Lichavis wanted to join the Buddha on his journey. Excuse me. But the Buddha didn't want to have such a large entourage. So he decided to give the Lichavis his alms bowl as a way of encouraging them to stay put and not follow him. And today in Kesariya, there's this large stupa in pretty good condition, which dates to between 200 and 750 in the Common Era, so built after the Buddha's time. But it's thought that this stupa marks the spot where the Lichavis built an original stupa and to hold the bowl, the golden bowl that the Buddha had given to them. So I went there and thought about the Buddha's bowl. Then the Buddha went to a town called Pawa. And this is where he had his last meal. And while they were in Pawa, he met a blacksmith called Cunda. And Cunda invited the Buddha and his small entourage to a meal and offered the Buddha a special dish, which is thought contained pork or mushrooms or perhaps both. And the Buddha soon realized that the dish that he was eating was bad, wasn't healthy. And he told Cunda to bury the remains so that no one else could eat it and get sick. And sure enough, shortly after he had eaten it, the Buddha developed a painful illness, which was probably dysentery. And although he was in a lot of pain and getting worse, he left Pawa and crossed the Kakuta River and arrived in Kushinagar. But when he was in Kushinagar, he instructed Ananda, his disciple, to go back to Pawa and to tell Cunda that he shouldn't feel bad about serving the Buddha his last meal. And the Buddha told Ananda to tell Cunda that actually it was as meritorious an act to feed the Buddha his last meal as it had been for Sujata to give him his first meal after he stopped those extreme self-mortification practices. And you might remember that I talked about Sujata last week and showed her shrine and the stupa where her family lived. So there was no, in Buddhism, there is no blame placed on Cunda at all. In fact, he is venerated. However, that being said, a stupa that was built for him is obviously in complete disrepair and broken down. This is what it looks like today. There's a couple of plastic chairs here and a water pump, and just this little kind of broken down sign acknowledging that it is Kunda's stupa. And around the back there were actually some cows grazing on a few blades of grass that were poking through. But what compassion the Buddha showed to tell Ananda to go back to Pawa and tell him that it was okay. He hadn't done any wrong in giving the Buddha his last meal. So, so the Buddha got to Kushinagar, and by that time he couldn't go any further, and he lay down between two sal trees to rest. And you may remember that his mother Maya had given birth to him while she was holding on to a sal tree. So this species of tree is important in Buddhism. And the sal tree, I understand, has a really short, it flowers only for a short period of time. And so it's a symbol in Buddhism of impermanence, marking the Buddha's birth and his death, and the fact that it only flowers for such a short period of time. So he lay down between two sal trees and soon died, passing into what's called Parinirvana. And his last words were, supposedly, "Be a lamp unto yourself, work out your salvation, strive on diligently." So that was his last advice, his last guidance to his followers. And when he died, after he died, apparently the earth shook and shooting stars filled the sky, and there were spontaneous fires and naturally resounding melodies of celestial music filled the air, and the devas were present to mark the Buddha's passing. And he was cremated 7 days after his death because his followers waited for the chief disciple, someone called Mahakassapa, to arrive to officiate at the cremation. Mahakassapa had not been at Kushinagar when the Buddha died. So 7 days later, with Mahakassapa in attendance, the Buddha was cremated. And originally, his ashes were to go to the Sakyan clan, the clan that he was born into. But shortly after his cremation, 6 other clans arrived on the scene, including and also King Ajasathu, who was the son of King Bimbisara. You may remember I talked about Ajasathu and King Bimbisara last week because he imprisoned his father, King Bimbisara, in an underground jail and didn't let him to see the Buddha or be fed. He starved him to death, basically. And so these 6 clans arrive along with the king, demanding the ashes of the Buddha. And in order to resolve the dispute, a Brahmin called Drona decided, and avoid bloodshed, Drona decided to divide the ashes of the Buddha into 8 portions and gave 1 portion to each of the claimants. So, at Kushinagar, this is the Parinirvana temple and stupa, and this marks the spot where the Buddha died. There's the stupa here, the Parinirvana stupa, and inside this rather strange looking building is a very large statue of the Buddha, and it's called the Reclining Buddha, and I'll show you what it looks like in just a minute. And it represents the Buddha in the position that he was in when he died, reclining on his right side with his head to the north, his feet to the south, and facing towards the west. And this statue is about 1500 years old and is made from a single block of red sandstone. So this is 81 feet from here, and you can't quite see the bottom down here. And you can't see the sandstone, the original sandstone today at all, because the entire statue has been covered with gold leaf by pilgrims, and you can see it here on the Buddha's head and also on his shoulder here, but it's completely covered all the way down with gold leaf. And also on top of him, you'll see these gold cloths have been placed as a sign of devotion by visiting pilgrims. And when I was there, a group of pilgrims came in carrying one of these large gold cloths and very carefully placed it over the statue. And this is what it looked like. So this was them coming in. You see, they're all holding a piece of the cloth and gently putting it over the statue. This is the Buddha's head up here, and this is his feet here. They've all got their lotus flowers to offer to the Buddha, and then they lowered the cloth onto the statue, and this is them praying and meditating afterwards. And the lotus flowers were all by the Buddha's head that they had offered. And you can also see here that this whole statue is surrounded by a glass enclosure with a brass railing on top. This is about waist height. And at this end here, there is a gate through the glass wall. You have to kind of duck underneath the railing to get in. And inside, of course, is the statue itself and what the offerings, but also most of the time there is a Burmese monk there who is collecting the offerings from the pilgrims and placing them by the Buddha's head, and making sure that the place is safe. And so after these pilgrims, after I took this picture, I moved back round to the head of the Buddha, and you can see the monk. This is him here, just half of him. And I was just meditating quietly, and then to my utter surprise and shock, the Burmese monk looked straight at me and beckoned me and invited me to scrunch down through this gate and into the glass enclosure. And that doesn't happen to everyone. I saw a couple of other people while I was there being invited into the glass enclosure, but it was pretty extraordinary. And I was, as I say, I was completely shocked and amazed. So I kind of crawled through here, and he invited me to touch the statue, to touch the gold leaf. And then he took some of the gold leaf from the statue because it's not that firmly attached. He took some of the gold, a loose piece of the gold leaf, and he put it on my forehead. And I was totally blown away. I I was really shocked, you know. And then I crawled my way out of there again and sat in meditation again. It was really an amazing experience to for that to happen. And the gold leaf stayed on my forehead for the rest of the day, and came off in the shower the next morning. But it was a lovely, lovely experience. Also at Kushinagar is the Ramabhar Stupa, and this is where the Buddha was cremated. This is the cremation site of the Buddha, and it's about 1.5 miles from the Parinirvana Stupa and temple that I just showed you. And this stupa contained one portion of the Buddha's ashes, one of those 8 portions, that was given to the Malla kings, Malla, the Malla kings who ruled over Kushinagar at the time of the Buddha. So, yeah. So that's the story of the Buddha's life. And I want to close for today there. And next time, there's one more talk about the pilgrimage that I want to give. And I'm going to talk about the caves at Ajanta and Ellora, which are located close to a town called Aurangabad, which is about a 2-hour flight south and west of Delhi. And these caves are they're rock-cut monasteries. They're cut into the rock. They're just amazing. They were one of the highlights of the whole trip for me, without any question. And I'll also talk about Nalanda, which was back in Rajgir that I talked about today, but Nalanda wasn't founded until after the Buddha's death, and it was the first residential university in the world and was a Buddhist university. And I will also offer some closing reflections next time on the notion of pilgrimage and what it all meant to me. Where I am in kind of processing it all. So, so that's coming up next week. But now I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and I'm also going to stop the recording.